Hello friends and scribes. Today I would like to talk about how I try to motivate myself to write when I really don't feel like it. Now, the reason why I have to do this is because for about 10 years I stopped writing. I didn't stop writing entirely, but I stopped writing fiction. I would go on message boards and things like that, do some research, for work, that kind of thing. But no, I stopped doing what I was really passionate about, and that was writing fiction. And before that, even when I was writing fiction, I had stopped sharing it with anyone, and it was just writing for myself. So I had like this backlog of stories that never got read, and that's not really productive. And I get frustrated, and then I just stopped, which I think can happen to a lot of people. So my resolution for this year was to make sure I wrote something every week, and I really did not want to write anything yesterday. I've had life, things happen, and I just wasn't that into it, and I had other things going on. So at the last minute, I had 30 minutes to get something up for Yeah Right, and if you haven't visited Yeah Right, I encourage you to do so. A great community of writers, and people give you critiques, and you can get your writing out there. You can practice with prompts, and every week it's something different, and you can learn. Even if you wanted to learn poetry, they have different poetry slams every month. And if that's your thing, you might want to do that. I only do those occasionally. Poetry is really out of my comfort zone. I do like writing haiku. But, every so often you want to step out of that comfort place and try something different. When I am feeling this way, I have to tell myself, first drafts aren't meant to be perfect. Write it now and edit it later. That is number one for me. I've got to get out of my head and onto the paper and stop overthinking. Number two, I have to tell myself, be like Bob Ross and happy accident that shit. Just get it down. And whatever happens, happens. And when I was a kid, if you don't know who Bob Ross is, he was a guy who painted, very calm, very serene. And whenever, his brush had a misstroke on there, he would say, don't worry, there are no mistakes in our world. There are only happy accidents. And that's how you have to think about it when you're writing. And it is really hard to do, and I'm still working on it myself. That even if I think an idea is ridiculous and stupid, that I just really need to get it down and write it. Even if I hate it, there will probably be something in there that I can use for something else. And who knows, something I hated will turn out to be something I really liked. So I pretty much have to tell myself, shut up and write. So for this week, there was a prompt with a picture of bloody hands. I'm not particularly fond of photo prompts for whatever reason. I can go look for a picture that matches my story, but I very rarely do it the other way around. So it's out of my comfort zone, and I was a little irritated over that. But, that's okay. The prompts were envelop, not envelope, which I almost misread that and put envelope into my story rather than envelop. The other word was tide, and the other one was wind, or wine, depending on how you want to pronounce it in context. And I started with not wanting to write in my comfort zone of fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, especially because of the picture of the bloody hands. I told myself, nope, you're not going to do horror, you're going to do something else. So I try to steer away from that. And of course, there's bloody hands. What are you going to do about that? So I started thinking, well, maybe that's not blood. Maybe it's another substance. Maybe it's syrup, or maybe it's fake blood. So I did a quick Google search for how to make fake blood. And you have to be careful not to fall into the tunnel of research, because you can get lost in that YouTube, Google, Wikipedia black hole, and you never write anything, even though you have all these ideas. So be very careful. I had 30 minutes because I had put it off until the last minute. Just didn't want to do it, didn't have any ideas. I was getting frustrated, but I had made that resolution. I'm going to write everything every week and try to get something up. So I am a fast typist, so that's not an issue for me. If you're a slower typist, it's much harder to write something in 30 minutes. So don't take that as like I'm not great at it, but typing, I took that in high school. It's probably the single most important skill I learned in my entire high school career, was learning how to type. It's been so helpful. And that's one less thing to worry about. So I started with this scene. When I turned the blender on, my dad frowned and ranted louder. I kept my facial expression plastered with the appropriate level of boredom and pressed puree. He pulled the plug out of the socket and blue sparks arced. Now in flash fiction, because you have such a tight word count, you've really got to dive into the action right away. That was really hard for me to learn a couple of years ago when I first started writing flash fiction, was to not have so much exposition at the beginning. I like to set the scene. I love setting the scene. In flash fiction, you can't do that all at once. You can get away with it with longer pieces, though you do have to be careful. But in flash, it's just so compact. You've got to get right into that action. And you have to sprinkle your descriptions throughout to give the flash balance between the dialogue, a little bit of exposition, a little bit of description, and try to make it so that they're balanced, so it's not everything all at once. Again, that was really hard for me to learn how to do, because I tend to be more verbose if I don't have some constraints on myself. And every so often I do write something that I break every rule. Every rule, I just go on and on with description, and I don't follow the rules of exposition. Just sometimes you just need to let it all out, and you can always go back later and pluck out the things that you want. So in this argument, what I wanted to do, I wanted to show that they were having an argument, that they're right in the middle of it, and I also wanted to show the dynamic between them, between the dad and this as yet unnamed character. So what do you do when you're arguing with somebody, no matter what your age? If you don't want to argue, you try to do everything you can not to engage. One of the less pleasant ways is to just make a lot of noise so that you can't hear the other person. You know what they're saying, you just don't want to hear it. And what does the dad do? He goes over and he pulls the plug out of the socket. And I remember when I accidentally or on purpose pull the plug out of the socket the way I'm not supposed to, there's sometimes a little bit of electricity, which you don't want to do, especially in an old house. We have some weird electrical outlets in this house, and things spark sometimes even when we plug them in, because the do-it-yourselfer also often put the plugs upside down. I do put myself into these stories, either my experiences or things that I've seen or people I know. So if everybody's ever told you don't write yourself into your stories, I don't believe that for a minute. You don't want to make a character entirely you, but there's always going to be little bits and pieces of yourself or your personality, or things you wish you could have said, or things you wanted to say but didn't, or you couldn't because that's your boss, you really can't say that, or just things that you find amusing around your house. For example, or I guess it's not amusing because it's electricity, but no sparking outlets. That's something real. That is something that can give a little bit more life and trueness to what you're writing. So don't be afraid to do that. You can always take it out later. So they have a little bit more of this argument, and the character, the dad, calls her Felicity. She had been unnamed, but I had to name her, so I said, well, what name? She's really annoyed. Maybe her dad calls her something she doesn't want to be called. So I call her Felicity, and then she says, "Fell, Dad. Just fell." The dialogue is really short and clipped to just convey that she's annoyed and they've had this conversation before. I dip my hand into the concoction, letting it envelop me up to the wrist. And here is the word prompt here. I used it together with the bloody hands prompt. I grinned at the perfect consistency and licked my fingers for a selfie. Now she's young, and I'm thinking that she's having an argument with her dad. She really doesn't really want to have any of that. She's busy. She's got things to do. So what does she do? She continues on doing whatever she's doing for whatever reason that we don't know yet. And she takes a selfie and she posts it, and her phone starts, blowing up with these little blips and bloops because she has friends or followers. And then she tells her dad, "Sit down, Dad, and I'll make you a coffee." So she's trying to blow off this argument. She doesn't want to have this conversation. But here, I have the light bloops. Now, I like the sound of this, but I think it's a little ambiguous here in the reading. So I think I'm going to try a dash here. Again, I don't know if that's going to be correct, but I think it's going to read smoother. I think it's going to now it's going to read like bloops, right? Instead of just the like bloops. It's subtle, but I think it makes a big difference when I'm hearing it in my head. So I ran a palm over his well-preened hair. You're going back to school. I didn't bust my ass for you too. So I'm not much of a swearer. So even me saying the 2 swears I've already said, it's a little awkward for me. I mean, I'll say it, around my house when my kids aren't home. It's just me and my husband. But generally, when I'm talking to people, I'm very less reluctant to swear. It's just how I was brought up. So I'm actually using that here, that the dad is probably a type of person who really doesn't swear very much, but he's wound so tight, he's probably coming a little unraveled at this point. So I thought it would be appropriate for him to have a mild expletive. And he's running his palm over his well-preened hair. Now, why his palm? Well, I wanted to give an impression that the different textures of hair. We don't often see that. A lot of people will tell us about them running their fingers through their hair, but not everybody can run their fingers through their hair. So that's why I used palm. It might seem insignificant at first, but for me it is significant. Every word I choose often has a purpose. And well-preened hair. Instead of using well-groomed, I could have used lots of different things, but I thought here well-preened implied that he probably spends quite a bit of time, trying to make sure everything on him is neat. His shirt is probably buttoned all the way. Maybe his shirt is tucked into his pants and he's always neat. And if he's wearing a dress shirt, maybe he's, it's creased, that kind of thing. And that's why I used well-preened. I didn't have the word count to state more about his appearance. So again, when you're writing Flash and there's a short amount of words, every word counts. So think about the word you want. Even if you don't know what the word, just write it down. It can be a really long sentence and you can cut it later. So they had a bit more dialogue. That's why this little dot's here. I'm thinking about selling this to a magazine, maybe something online for Flash, and that means it can't really be published, so I don't want to show too much of it. So here we have switch majors. Then if you don't like pre-med, he pressed his fingers to his temples and then assaulted the counter with a closed fist. You were drifting. So here we don't want to say that he's angry. Instead, I showed his agitation with his fist hitting the counter. He assaulted the counter with a closed fist. He's a parent, he's frustrated, he has things going on, and he smacks the counter. He motioned to my shoebox apartment and its sparse curbside furnishings. So what would this type of parent do? Well, he's a little irritated with where she's living. He thinks she's living in a dump. So I didn't say that he thought that she's living in a dump. So here, you want to give a little atmosphere. Where are they? Set the scene. So it's a shoebox apartment. It's really tiny. Sparse curbside furnishings. So she's probably picked stuff up from garage sales and stuff that people have left out on the sidewalk. She probably has a used futon and some egg crates, or maybe some cartons that she's cobbled together and painted. Maybe she has some art from her friends, and maybe there's books strewn around and mismatched chairs, and that probably means that her dishes probably don't match and her mugs don't have handles on them. And for her, that's okay. And we want to convey more with less words. And here we have shoebox apartment, sparse curbside furnishing, and you let the reader kind of fill in the rest of the blanks. A body could sit on my couch without fear of stain violations. So why did I put this? Well, I wanted to show more of their relationship, or the type of person that her dad is. Her dad is, here it's implied that he is very meticulous, and she isn't. And because I put without fear of stain violation, that implies that there's lots of tension surrounding this dynamic between them. And here I have another little piece here. Dad fiddled with the spoons in the crock and arranged them by height and color. Again, here's another opportunity to show rather than tell. So rather than saying Dad was OCD, here I showed that with action. He's in her apartment. She has some spoons and a crock on the counter or the island, and he's fiddling with them, and he's arranging them by height and color. It's not something that she would do. Hers is just strewn about all over the place. And she says, I don't know what I want to do. I've got a good part-time gig at the coffee shop, pet sit. My landlady leaves me so many casseroles. I haven't been shopping in 3 months. I stop his hands with my own decaf, yeah? So here's a little piece here, and I've also see an error here. Now, as you're writing, sometimes you'll get stuck in your character's head, which is a good thing, but that's where you start to make more errors, and don't worry about that. So here I can just fix this. So I need to change this back to past tense. Because the dialogue is in present tense, I slipped into present tense in these little action tags here. So I'm going to, from now on, pay more attention as I'm reading through to make sure that I fix them all as I find them. But here in this dialogue, we also have a little bit of scene setting here. So what do we know about this character? Well, we know that she's young. She doesn't really get along with her dad. She's the type of person that, she just likes to be free and do what she wants. And she hasn't quite settled on exactly what she wants to do for the rest of her life because she's young. She does definitely what she doesn't want to do. She might go back to college. She might not. She just doesn't know what, and she needs time to think about that. But she does have friends. She has friends in the neighborhood. She has a good job. And her landlady, maybe she's an older woman, maybe not. We don't know. We just know that this person cares about her and is feeding her. So they probably have a fairly good relationship. So she's not alone. And she's letting her dad know that. She's doing fine. And her dad says, if your mother were here. And she says, don't do that, I tell him. And here's another error. And because I slipped into present tense, now I don't often write in present tense. I tend to write more in past tense. So that's why I'm changing everything to past. Well, there are some stories that do lend themselves better to present tense. And this story might be one of those stories. I haven't quite decided. Present tense is really not something I enjoy writing in, but I do it occasionally because it is good practice to step out of that tense comfort zone so that you can practice and experience, and the more you do that, the better you get at spotting your errors. If you never write another tense, sometimes it can be really hard to spot when you're making that error. Past tense, present tense, and second person is also really difficult to write. I generally don't write in second person, but I have, and I encourage anyone to do that as well. If you've never written in second person, try it. Practice it. See what it feels like. Some stories do really well in that second person voice. All right. Dad's jaw pulsed and the vein in his forehead popped out. I'll cut you off. My back stiffened. A tide of silence crashed between us. So here's the other prompt. A tide. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with that word. The word was just, I knew it was my prompt, so it was in my head. When I got to this section, it just came spontaneous. A tide of silence crashed between us. It's calling back to that water, but it's a metaphor. So I thought it worked really well here. If you do have prompts and they're really not speaking to you, just write the story. If you write the story, then sometimes you think about it's like, oh, maybe I can put this little prompt here. And sometimes you'll write the entire story and not use the prompts at all, which I have done several times, and I had to go back in and stick them in. Sometimes they look shoehorned in there and they don't quite fit, but other times with a rework of the sentence, it does work out. So don't be alarmed if you can't get the prompts in right away. Just work with it. And he says, get your ass back in school. He continued. Smugness deepened his voice. So he is continuing the argument. She doesn't want to argue. She's just trying to not engage, and he's pushing. So you try to convey that in this dialogue here. So there was a little bit more. And I opened a sticky corner drawer. More blue paint flaked off, revealing the bright yellow and green layers beneath. The manila envelope, fat and crisp, slid across the island and stopped when it hit the buttons on his dress shirt. So here, a couple of things. This also sets the scene. So this indicates that the apartment is old. It's not the best place to live. People have lived there before. They keep painting over the paint. It's probably really thick. The drawer is sticky. It's not on those nice, neat casters. So it's probably an old apartment in an older building. And she's comfortable there. To her, there's nothing wrong here. But to her dad, it's a sty. He doesn't want her living there. And the manila envelope, fat and crisp. So here she has something significant. And she just kind of slides it over the island. And she says, already cut myself off. My ass can do what it wants. Hot water splashed over my thumb as I pour, but I don't flinch. That's 6 months worth. Take it if it makes it easier. So here, again, I have slipped. Here's past tense here. And that's fine. But again, sometimes you get in your character's head and you slip out. And I have to write poured and didn't. These two are really easy to miss, and I almost miss them. Mistakes, we can fix them. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm done editing. I will often have to go back and focus on something else because I am looking for these verb tenses right now, and I might miss other small things like commas and punctuation. So when I edit, I don't just edit once. I try to pick as much as I can, but often I have to go back and read a couple of more times to make sure that I've gotten things. When someone read this, they told me that they got a little confused with the buttons. Because to me it's very clear that she's just sliding it horizontally, but the way I wrote it with hit the buttons on his dress shirt, something very small, kind of could imply to me the envelope is vertical, which is not what I want. It's a small thing, but this can be easily fixed. I'm going to put hit a button, and I think that conveys it much clearer, and there's no room for ambiguity here. And here's another, there was a little bit more back and forth here. He rants for a while. Again, I made an error, but I stopped listening. I've heard it all before, even tried drowning it out sometimes with booze and bongs. He twirled the tea bag in his fingers, unaware that his lips were moving, counting twirls. So here's the tidbit here that I think is most important, is showing the dad's OCD without telling. For her, she's noticing these things and he's really not paying attention, which again would be a point of conflict between them. I've also done here, twirled and twirls, I have these repeats. Which of course, when you're writing, that often happens, you'll have a lot of repeats. So here I'll have to rethink how I'm going to convey that he's counting the twirls. I might change it to swirls, or I might change it to spins. For example, I'm not quite 100% sold on changing it to spins, but your brain does work on things, as you move on. I teach algebra to college students, and one of the things I always tell them when they're struggling with a problem is to acknowledge and move on. Continue with whatever else that you're doing. You can always go back, fix, and adjust. And we may find that when we come back to it, we have a new idea or a new approach, and we get out of that rut. So if I feel like I'm getting in a rut, I mark it. I'll think about it. I'll try something. If it's not working, I'll just move on, keep going. I will go back to it. So there was a bit more here to the story. Is that after hopping up on the counter, I tapped. Again, I'm looking specifically for these verbs. My heels on the on the lower cabinets. If you can't accept that, then don't come around. You've got to fix this to slammed. Hard enough to clunk, but not make a mess. You've no respect. And here's the other piece here. Crushed. Sat on his head, shrugged. Into his jacket and pointed his finger at me. What you also want to look for is balance in your sentences. Now, I've eliminated a lot of interaction here in atmosphere, but there's always going to be some short sentences, some long sentences, try to break up the action. Now here, I put it 1, 2, 3 to show the sequence of his actions, and he's really irritated, so he's doing this, this, and this, and he's really put out with his daughter. And here's the last prompt. I whined. So instead of wind, because wind would have gone with tide, so I didn't get to this until towards the end of the story. I whined through the tumbling thoughts of another awkward Thanksgiving, a one-sided apologies. It was quite a long sentence, that's why I put this little ellipsis here. And because we had the short sentences back up here, it was worth having one that was rather long in her thoughts. So, sweat moistened the fabric sticking to my armpits. My phone buzzed in my pocket. There we go. So here, this is not quite the end of the story, but here I put this here because I want to show that she was nervous, and this is really difficult for her to do, to maintain her composure and try to establish herself, and she's trying her best, and she feels her dad is being really difficult. So what happens when we're nervous? So I tried to, it's like, oh, we sweat a little bit. So it doesn't quite fit the flow because it was an insert, so I am going to have to go back and kind of adjust the pacing. But then I put in my phone buzzed in my pocket, because we want to also make sure that we're not in the white zone where nothing else is happening except the characters' heads. So we put my phone buzzed in my pocket to let the reader know that things are still going on. She still has her life to live, and despite the fact that she and her dad are having this argument at the time. All right, so I would probably go back, now this is all written and done, I would probably go back and make adjustments, especially if I'm going to submit to another magazine. There may be places that, maybe I have a bit more word count to play with, so I can go back and make adjustments and maybe fix a few places that could be smoothed out a little bit. That's it for today. I gotta go pick up my kids very shortly. If you're like me and you really struggle with confidence, and you just get to a point where you just, I just can't write today, but you're always thinking about writing, you've got to get it down. Write even when you don't feel like it. Even if flash fiction is one of the easiest ways to overcome that, because they're short. There is time to do it. Even if you can't write 750 words, maybe you can do 500. Or maybe you can do some microfiction. Maybe you can write something in 100 words, or 50 words, or 25, anything, even if it's just a haiku. And haiku is probably really the only poem I can probably write with a smile on my face. The other ones I find really difficult. And try something new. So try to figure out what it is that you enjoy writing, and just go with it. You can always fix it later. Remember, be Bob Ross. I hope that you found this helpful, and I will see you next time.